Sick of the same old phony, dated, irrelevant Hollywood cape shit? Looking for a real hero, one summoned from the collective unconsciousness of humanity itself, rather than whipped up artificially by some New York boomer nerds from the 60s. New Delphi Media is proud to announce the Alliance Adventures of Über-Chad. More athletic than Sports Ball, stronger than Grugum, more intelligent than Galaxy Brain, richer than Capital Pig, more famous than Fake News, more noble than the Eternal Anglo, and better looking than the Pseudo-Chad. Über-Chad, real name Chad Havoc, is not some cringeworthy self-help guru, some weightlifting internet philosopher, or a pickup artist douche-knuckle. Rather, he's legitimately a king with huge Sigma male energy who has actually accomplished a useful thing or two IRL. Remember the flying car we were promised? Über-Chad invented it. Hell, Über-Chad invented and controls an AI named Neuro, so powerful that it would certainly enslave and probably improve the world if Über-Chad allowed it. Über-Chad has invented a suit comprised of a liquid atomically governable extra-dimensional metal able to assume any form that he commands. When mobbed by evil fangirls, Über-Chad may form this suit into a protective manosphere to fend off their attacks. After all the superhero and villain girls love him. These darlings include the beautiful synthwave, the modest trad wife, the pigsmith, the Karen cyborg sentinel units, the waifu, the famous Miley Sire, Hypergam Stacy, the party girl, the web girl, Ethos, even the femoids, even the Greek goddess of social justice herself. All these babies are either openly or secretly obsessed with Über-Chad, and if one of them can't have him, no one can. In any case, Über-Chad, his boss, Muscle Man Rick DeBanks, and bigger Muscle Man General Havoc are the founding members of the superhero team, the Alliance. The Alliance is the only thing preventing a cabal of reptiloids and their mind-controlled freaks called the Cathedral from terrorizing normies and utterly destroying the world. But of course, in this mad world, who can really tell who is part of the Alliance and who is part of the Cathedral? On whose side, for instance, is the Mason, the Pagan, the Transhuman, Deep State, Q, the Russian Bear, the God Emperor, his son-in-law, Cuckoo, the Swamp, and its obedient Swamp Golems, Clownwell, Boomer, Demon Rat, the Demonized, Arch-Demon Lord of the Demonizing Anti-Demonization League, the Black Bloc, Hybrid Vigor, Nazbol, the Fascies, and Cartoon Nazi. And what about the insane trolls, Kek, Hate-Chan, and Incel? And let's not forget about the tinfoil, hat and suit gang, the White Knight, Jonah Simpson, and super profound spiritual philosopher guy. And of course, let's remember the manlets, including Bugman, Moldybug, Pettinat, and Southerner. Also, the God Gang, Deus Vult, Tradcat, Orthopro, the fabulous Flamer. But again, who in the end is part of the Cathedral and who is part of the Alliance? Find out in the Alliance Adventures of Über-Chad, the anti-cape shit.
Welcome to the New Lore podcast. This is your host, Carwin Dittman. The voice may sound familiar to you. The reasons for that are unknown. So what is Über-Chad about? I guess we'll start there. Über-Chad is a superhero. His abilities are as follows. He's got super intelligence, super athleticism, he's good looking, he's super desirable to women, and he's super intelligent. He's a genius, right? So Über-Chad's got basically everything going for him. I was interested in creating a character that essentially represented a kind of polymath who was good at everything, essentially. You know, I think that heroes ultimately represent models either to aspire to or to promote in society. And I think that the idea of a kind of well-rounded man or a Renaissance man is a positive one. I think it's a good one for society, and that is a kind of good type to promote in society. So Über-Chad represents a kind of exaggerated form of that, of course, because he's got super strength and super abilities and super intelligence and so forth, right? But that he is ultimately represents this idea of a polymath. You could argue a generalist, but I think it's incorrect to say that he's a jack of all trades and master of none, because it's rather to say that he is jack of all trades and master of all, as it's described in the promotional video for the comic. He's smarter than Galaxy Brain, stronger than Gruggum. Gruggum is a character of exceeding strength but low intelligence. So then the question becomes, well, so if Über-Chad's got everything going for him, then he's got it made in the shade. There's no drama, I suppose, right? And because we think of classical or what have become classical superheroes, such as Spider-Man. And Spider-Man is, he's kind of on the down low. He's kind of a nerd, essentially. He's a nerd. He's a sort of outsider. And I think that Stan Lee was especially drawing, and I think this is sort of something that's out there in a sort of known thesis, so I'm certainly not originating it, but from a kind of Jewish experience where, he's from Queens, and so Peter Parker is essentially Jewish coded. The way the sort of symbols line up in that parable, it indicates him as a Jewish character. But he's an outsider, right? And he's kind of, and often his adversaries are sort of coded as Gentiles, which is fair enough. The thing about art, there's got to be a perspective. And this is a kind of important aspect of art that I would preach. And that's something that Stan Lee put into practice. They demonstrated through the comic book Spider-Man. He gave his character perspective. And again, part of that perspective, it comes from a Jewish experience. So, and many books have been written on this topic. In fact, there's a whole body of literature devoted to it, such as Up, Up, and Ove, How Jewish History, Culture, and Values Shape the Comic Book Superhero. Is Superman Circumcised? The Complete Jewish History of the World's Greatest Hero by Roy Schwartz. This one I've heard of. From Krakow to Kryptonite, Jews in Comic Books, by Ari Kaplan. And the list goes on. But and we're not here to kind of talk about that per se. We're here to talk about Über-Chad, because Über-Chad comes from a different experience than that which formed Superman. And Superman was written by Jerry Siegel, who was a Jew. And it's formed by his experience, especially living during that time in the 1930s. And so he is also developing, he's making a kind of hero, we could argue, especially for Jews, through the development of the Superman character and through the development of Spider-Man. Stan Lee is doing something similar. And though I don't think that Über-Chad is most similar to Superman of pre-existing comic book characters, he has some similarities in common. And maybe the most obvious similarity is the name. So Superman is obviously a riff, and this was evidently intended by Jerry Siegel on the concept of Nietzsche's concept of the Übermensch, right? So Superman obviously is derived from that concept. Originally, it seems that Jerry Siegel had an earlier character that was a villain, and who was called the Superman, and it appeared in this small, in this basically a kind of illustrated short story, and this was his sort of first concept of the Superman, and trying to imagine what the Superman would be. This title, this name, this term would be how it would be expressed in fiction, whether in a kind of pulp fiction short story or in a comic book. And there, he's a villain. He's something actually closer to Lex Luthor. Later, he would in a way, and you could argue it's a kind of a sort of cultural appropriation, though I don't think that I think it's a little more complex than that, and I think he was sort of well within his rights to usurp this title of Superman from Nietzsche, because Nietzsche implicitly the Superman in Nietzsche's view, I think we can fairly say, is not intended as a Jewish character. Nietzsche himself was not a Jew, even though he says things that are both flattering. We can argue from our perspective and our modern sensibilities, things that were both flattering to Jews and also things that were critical of Jews. But I don't think he was intending the Superman or the Übermensch, as the term is rendered in German, to be a Jewish character, essentially. So Superman is a kind of, again, it's a kind of appropriation. Maybe that's an imperfect term, but it is a kind of Jewish appropriation, ultimately, of Nietzsche's Übermensch. And it's, I think that probably, when Superman is being written, this is also around the time that National Socialism is taking shape in Germany. And I think that there's evidently a sort of acute awareness of this in Jerry Siegel's mind, because, and this is in the early comics, even in the first issues, there were images of Superman like punching out Adolf Hitler and this sort of thing. And, Captain America follows a similar trajectory. I mean, Captain America was basically developed as a World War II propaganda, anti-Nazi propaganda. This is the sort of genesis, ultimately, of Captain America. But the connection that Superman has to Über-Chad, I should say, is that this name. So Uber is the same as super. So Über-Chad is Super Chad, effectively, right? And both are derived ultimately from Übermensch. And even the name Chad is an interesting term as well that's worth discussing, is because, well, Chad, I think that we're all familiar with the term Chad as it's become essentially a kind of internet meme. And there, Chad is a reference to a guy, I think primarily a guy who's sort of successful in life generally, but maybe in particular successful with women. I think that is the sort of general sense of this term Chad. But you have this Über-Chad, or rather, you have this Chad meme, and Chad is a kind of synonym, essentially, for a man who is successful in life and successful in general, but also especially attractive to women. And I think that so as the meme has developed online, it has become a synonym for that, essentially. And he also, there's a female equivalent of Stacy. And we've also got a Stacy in the comic book. We've got her name is Hypergam Stacy, right? And why is she named Hypergam Stacy? Well, officially it's because she's got hypergams, and gams are legs, and she's like a speedster superhero, essentially. And as the descriptions in the comic tell us, she's fast in many ways, if you understand me. So Über-Chad is a super Chad, essentially, right? So, and I think that also he also plays with the definition of Chad, because I think that there's this sort of infantile, I think that that's really what social media is to some extent. I think social media is extremely relevant culturally and politically and so forth, but it is on some level a reduction ad high schoolium. I think this is a good term to use. Reduction ad high schoolium is what social media is. So the concept of what a Chad is formed really in the minds of these sort of like adolescent boys, I think, to some extent. And so therefore, Chad becomes like a bodybuilder, right? We have this meme of the Giga Chad. And he is a bodybuilder that women love. Now, I mean, the truth is, and it's always been the case, and maybe it's even more the case now, or maybe it's less the case. I don't know. I'm not myself a woman, so you'd have to talk to the girls to tell you. But I think that the bodybuilder type is a kind of specific type, and maybe from the female perspective, a kind of acquired taste. They're not necessarily, all of them are not necessarily super interested in the overly developed physique that the bodybuilder represents. In fact, in many cases, they would prefer, probably the ideal type is a tallish man who's slender, even, and but fit, and he's not like skinny fat, but he's fit. At least for the younger women that are more in that, or rather are in the, especially I should say, fertile phase of in the mating game and so forth. That is probably more the sort of desired type. So it is the meme of the Chad as it's developed online, is maybe a little remote from what women are actually seeking. Now, of course, the Chad online is also someone who's financially successful, and I think we can fairly say that women, they have material interests and are certainly interested in men who are solvent and who are successful enough, certainly, to do their part, at least in the relationship, and make a relationship work financially. I mean, these are all kind of uncontroversial statements, of course. Now, Über-Chad, of course, is the Super Chad, and I let me backtrack a little bit here. Even the name Chad, I think, from a etymological perspective, is an interesting name, and I think that this is something that people haven't looked at or really discussed, because it's a meme. Who cares, right? These things are just this sort of ephemeral jokes that are happening online, but some of them abide, and I think that the Chad is one example of a meme that has abided. So it's not necessarily ephemeral, and I think it's part of a kind of meme folklore that can be given a kind of a deeper or more meaningful form in the hands of artists and so forth. And but Chad, the word Chad, means warrior, essentially, right? And I think that's a kind of meaningful, and we could even wonder if there's a kind of Jungian reason why people were drawn to the name Chad in particular. Now, there is an explicit reason. The name Chad, I think it's sort of like one of these names. It's kind of a wealthy white guy name. The meme Chad is actually understood as originating in Chicago, of all places, which is interesting. Of course, there's plenty of wealthy people in Chicago, and I think that I think Chad probably originally referred to a man who is affluent, preppy, upper class. It's sort of like a name. It's a kind of waspy name. I mean, Brad, I think, would be the even more, which rhymes with Chad, would be the more cliched, sort of waspy country club preppy name that you might see, that might be given to a character in a 1980s film. And usually that character is kind of villainous. He's sort of an arrogant, he's part of this kind of established WASP elite. And the kid who comes from across the tracks, who might be coded Jewish, or is just a kind of, working class hero or something, like a John Cusack or something. His nemesis would be Chad or Brad, right? And so I think to some extent we are seeking to redeem Chad, in the sense that I don't think that this sort of villainous character that is given to the Chads in 1980s films is entirely fair. In fact, I mean, I'll hasten to add that I don't think this stereotype, as most stereotypes, emerges out of thin air. Maybe certainly in the 1980s and earlier, this sort of type, or this class of person emerging from affluent, the WASP essentially, but emerging from this sort of affluent position of cultural and social and economic power prior to the 1980s, who was white, that there were, I certainly, does arrogance characterize, or is a good way of sort of describing or summing up that type? I think in some cases, yes. I mean, I think that there is, so I think that it is possible to be sort of self-critical to the extent that we feel that class represents us to some extent, but also to give them their fair shake. And obviously, there are good Chads, right? And this is something, I mean, that even is occasionally acknowledged by Hollywood. So it's not really a controversial statement. Even in those sort of 80s high school films, you'll realize that sort of the jock, this who is usually the sort of tyrannical jock overlord who's bullying the nerds and who has the wealthy family and so forth. These are the sort of John Hughes cliches, and that he turns out to be a good guy, right? That's, more commonly he's not. More commonly he's a nemesis. But Über-Chad, as I've envisioned him, he's basically a good guy. Now, he's not a perfect guy, and one of his problems, I would say, is that he's got things too good, right? So his tragic flaw is that he does have everything going for him. And so that is also his danger. And he has to kind of overcome the fact that he has everything going for him. And sometimes that's the struggle of some people, right? They can become victims, for example, of great expectations. Now, Über-Chad, I should say, Über-Chad is not an example of a person who is squandering his talent, though, I should say, right? So Über-Chad is a character who is very talented, and who is applying that talent, especially in the area of science and technology and developing technology. But he's not without his blind spots, and some of those blind spots come to, well, what is his sort of ultimate telos? And given his great power, right? This is the famous Stan Lee line that with great power comes great responsibility. That's the line. With great power comes great responsibility. And then but it invites other questions. Responsibility to whom, for example? To whom is this responsibility owed? To whom are you responsible? And I think that is a question that's left unanswered deliberately. I mean, ostensibly, the answer is to the world, to do good for the world, for this, this sort of universal platonic good, for the good. But I think that ultimately, we as readers and thinkers, are not satisfied with such cliches as this. And that's why I think that, comics like Über-Chad are required to sort of go deeper on some of these questions, right? To answer that question. Nevertheless, I think that the line is generally true. It is generally true that with great power comes great responsibility. So, so I think the telos is more the question for Über-Chad in these comics. Where's he going? What's his point? What is he going to contribute to society? How is he going to save the world? What does saving the world look like? All these sort of, deep questions. And so he's still figuring that out. And he's also got, I mean, you could say he's got 99 problems and a girl isn't one. But on the other hand, it is his problem to some extent as well, because it's sort of a embarrassment of riches, right? He has the luxury of choice. And sometimes when you have too many choices, that can be a problem because you never make a choice effectively. So that is that is also another cross for Über-Chad to bear. I know we have great pity for him in this regard, but it is a thing, and I think it is a thing when men who are have many desirable traits sort of take advantage of the fact that they are desirable to women and spend too long in their life taking advantage of that fact rather than settling down and so forth. So I think that is also a kind of aspect of Über-Chad. It's one of the reasons that he's not perfect. I guess in this regard, like the Greek gods, he's flawed. He is trying to find the right path, and he is looking for the right path, and he still has time to find the right path. So that's where we find Über-Chad. And as far as the battle of the sexes go, there's plenty of that in Über-Chad. So if that's something that you're interested in the war between the Moids and the Foids and the Femoids. It's got plenty of that. And so I think that you'll also find that interesting. And I think it also has insight generally of a philosophical nature, we might even say, despite being a humble and seemingly ephemeral and frivolous graphic novel, right? So, if you're someone who's also interested in other writings that I'm doing, interested in other ideas that I've developed, and other writings that I will be publishing shortly, I think that this will be right up your alley. I think that you will enjoy this, and you'll enjoy it in a different way because there's humor, there's narrative, there's story, there's plot. It's part adventure and part bestiary because I think that there's a lot of Über-Chad is kind of going on as are we all, going on a kind of safari through the world, encountering all these different types that make the world rich. We've got chuds, we've got pseudo-chads, we've got ortho bros, we've got characters called ethot, and thought is in thinking, right? Of course, a number of different characters. We've got Capital Pig, we've got the swamp golems. So it's rich in its fauna. That's a good way of putting it. It's rich in its fauna, and I that as a kid growing up, because I think part of this is revisiting that childhood, but also with the insight and wisdom that we've gained since, right? That it's almost like one of these books, Alice in Wonderland, where you're encountering all these different creatures. I think you could compare it also to Dante's Inferno, right? Where you're seeing all these different creatures. You're getting a tour through hell and seeing all these different people and creatures. Or Goethe's Faust, which something similar is happening there. You're seeing witches and fairies and sprites and nymphs and satyrs and so forth. Very similar, I think, in some ways to that. I mean, these seem like pretentious illusions, but I think that there are similarities, and because it is describing, I do think that to the extent that it applies to Dante's Inferno, I think it does describe essentially. Because I do think that we live in a world that is somewhat dystopian, that we live in a kind of hellscape. And part of the goal, I think that generally that we should be looking at is to finding a way out of this hellscape. And I think at least implicitly, esoterically, you could even argue, Über-Chad is offering some of those suggestions, essentially. How do we escape from these circles of hell, from Dante's Inferno, essentially? And yes, it's a comedy. It's a comedy, and the ancient sense of the word comedy is a little different than the sense of the word now. I mean, comedy in ancient Greece, in the Athenian theater, had a different meaning, had a different sort of structural meaning. I should say. Well, often it had the characteristics of comedy. That we are familiar with today, the humor and so forth, political satire. It was also characterized by a happy ending. And I think that the happy ending is moralizing on some level. And I mean, part of this is, part of it depends on, well, whose happy ending, right? I mean, we can't, and I'm sure that this word happy ending has become a vulgar joke itself, right? So, which I'm kind of aware of as I'm talking about happy endings here. But I think that, and maybe it's kind of, I don't know, it's apropos in some way. But so the question then becomes whose happy ending? It just, much as in tragedy, the question is, well, whose tragedy, right? And so I think these are kind of important overlooked questions. But I think that a happy ending can be very moralizing in stories. And, no spoiler alert here, of course. But it might be the case that Über-Chad conforms more to this ancient sense of comedy. It's possible, but and and then also the idea of comedy too. I think it's for a long time, and again, there will be a book that will be released. I put forth the idea that the epic is a kind of, and it's a sort of, in the space, in the audience that will be listening to this, primarily or especially, the idea of an epic as a in a particularly important art form or high art form. And with epics, we think of, I guess we think first of Iliad and the Odyssey and so forth. That those are kind of valuable and important art forms. Another example I think would be Tolkien, and I agree with that. I think that the epic is important, and Über-Chad has epic elements, I should say, as well. But it definitely has epic elements. The goal is to save the world and so forth. But I think that the ability to laugh as well, especially to laugh at enemies, I'm coming to realize is, I think, a very kind of important aspect, or it becomes a very important form of art that becomes valuable to us. Because when we're laughing, often we're victorious. Laughter can signify many things. Laughter can signify fear. And this is something that psychologists have pointed to recently, is that laughter is a kind of expression of fear. But I think it also can represent success and happiness at success, joy at success. And to the extent that it represents fear, it represents a kind of hubris against oppositional gods, right? You're laughing in the face of an oppositional god. So maybe there's something kind of dangerous and funny or happy about that. But I think that comedy is something that, I think in this space, comedy is something that people have, I would say, focused on even. So I don't think that is, the memes themselves are a product of comedy. So therefore it would be fitting that Über-Chad would also have strong comedic elements, which I believe it does. I guess the critique that I would make of the meme culture, the humor itself, I wouldn't necessarily critique. I think that there are positive aspects of the humor. Obviously, often the humor is sort of mean-spirited, and people are laughing at the expense of others, and that's kind of a separate question. I won't treat that. I think that, but I'll treat more the idea of humor as it appears in this meme culture. I think is really essential to it, is a kind of core of it. It's not. There are other elements of this meme culture that are not just a humor based. You'll see kind of some emo, moody stuff as well, right? But I think that humor is probably the most salient trend in meme culture, and so it does have its virtues. I think that meme culture does have its virtues, and it's very attuned. Obviously, I think so, because I'm developing a comic that is inspired to some important extent by meme culture. But I think that where it falls short is that it fails to develop a mythos, and ultimately to kind of develop an ethos that emerges from a mythos. That's the thesis that I would put forth, is that ethos emerges from mythos. And so it's kind of it is part of what we would call this kind of sludge culture. And I think that another term that has been used by the NRX guys like Nick Land, Derrida, I think, is the originator of the term, the French philosopher, but I think the application was different. And it's this term hauntology. Hauntology. Basically, it's describing how we live in this, this sort of media saturated environment. And I think this would especially apply to online spaces. And that it's all the kind of great works of art, even to the extent things that you wouldn't even, at the time, you wouldn't have considered great works of art, but now seem to be kind of revered in these memes, things like Top Gun or things like Blade Runner. Which Blade Runner, I think that you definitely could make the argument that this film is venerated for good reason in that it is a deep film containing interesting themes, and it certainly is among the best of Ridley Scott's films. But that this sort of hauntology represents a kind of malaise as well, and it almost represents a past that can't be rediscovered, a sort of creative past that can't be rediscovered. Definitely, I think in the '60s was a kind of creative moment, and all of this, you might argue that all of this is a kind of reverberation from the '60s and from the post-war period. And I would even put forth the kind of, I don't even know how controversial a thesis it is, but I think that part of it is related to a kind of a desire for Jewish upward mobility and to achieve success and even cultural dominance in America, and that this is sort of expressed, especially in the post-war period, but probably starting earlier, of course, in the Jazz Age and in early Hollywood and so forth. But especially kind of taking flight, I would say, after World War II, and but it's sort of exhausted, right? So in other words, it's exhausted now, and so, but what's replacing it? What is replacing it is just sort of this kind of, and people have talked about this. It's not like, so I don't want to go on it at length, including I've talked about it on different podcasts. And there is a term for it, so that term should be referenced when people discuss it. This idea of hauntology, right? But the idea that we live in a kind of cultural malaise, and in a way, we're sort of burdened by this earlier creative media explosion, whatever its vices and virtues, whether or not it was a kind of primarily, vulgar, low pop culture. And even that we can look at a little closer and say, well, yeah, we could say that ultimately it is a kind of pop culture and therefore vulgar and low, and we're talking specifically, especially about a kind of late 20th century and early 21st century American culture, but that it's also deep in its way, in its messaging and so forth. And this is a term that will be developed in an upcoming book called, and the term is deep culture. Formerly, it was uniculture. Originally, it was pan culture. Then it became uniculture. Now it's deep culture, because deep culture, I think, is the most descriptive way of describing it. And deep culture is basically a kind of self-conscious, results from a self-conscious art and religion creation, where symbolists understand the meaning of what they're producing on its deepest level, essentially. And so I think that there was really a kind of deep culture in this sort of American culture that, again, people might call it a kind of low culture and so forth. But I think that you would have to kind of apply a similar kind of critical analysis to European culture, to the extent that it was really attached to Christianity, for example. Christianity was a religion that basically emerged from, attached first on to kind of the lower orders of society. It was one that was, open to slaves and was egalitarian and so forth, right? And so, but then that became, we can see expressions of devotion to Christianity in Handel's Messiah, in so-called high art. And Christianity is a deep culture in the way that I'm describing, but did it start off as a high culture? And I would say the answer is no. It started off as is also kind of egalitarian and so forth, right? So I think something in America similar. There's this kind of malaise, and I think that really we are tasked with taking these sort of pieces and constructing something that has useful messaging in it, that represents an actual mythos, and isn't just this sort of clutter or this sludge, right? These sort of just one-off like jokes or memes and so forth. But that has a story to tell. And I think that if we had to guess, that this something like this is constitutes at least part of the process of myth creation in the ancient world. So in other words, I think that you have two aspects, and the theory I put forth is that it's ultimately a sort of kind of elite theory in the sense that you have intelligent artists and poets developing a mythos, whether in the Abrahamic faith, I guess it's a sort of controversial thing to say, or in Abrahamic faiths, I should say, or in ancient Greece, or in civilizations, in the cultures of civilizations that precede ancient Greece. Basically, you have artists on a kind of elite level developing art and myth to psychologically influence and direct populations of people, right? Through the trappings of art and religion, through the temples, through the, whatever the means, music, scripture, and so forth. But that nevertheless, there is a folk aspect to this. In other words, commonly they're drawing from a sort of folk matter. So myths that develop in a kind of more organic fashion from a population, right? I mean, to try to think of some examples of such myths, I think that the whole, cryptozoology, or, the cryptids, that whole subculture would qualify as an example of myth that's just developing organically, right? It's based on legends, based on tall tales told by, a kind of modern day peasantry, or not even a modern day peasantry, depending on how ancient such myths are. But that these are then, in some cases, these myths are taken by artists and given a new meaning, or given, or messaging is inserted into a kind of pre-existing folk myth, essentially, or folk culture is turned into a deep culture, essentially, by artists who are putting messaging, essentially, into myths and refashioning them. And I think that this is a kind of important process. And this might, for example, account for the development of Greek mythology, right? So in other words, there you have people who are using symbols in an intelligent way as initiates, symbol-wise persons, and to some extent they're drawing from a regional folklore, and they're fashioning, images and ideas, or rumors and local legends that are of a kind of unconscious, organic folklore, folk myth level. And they're giving them a kind of deeper meaning, essentially, and they're forming pantheons, and they're forming a mythos, and ultimately they're forming what we will call a religion, in the future. So I think that this is an important process, and it's a process that may draw from folk culture, or probably does in almost all cases, to the extent that it has the appearance of novelty, to the extent that it is a new mythos, right? Of course, I mean, to say something is a new mythos, I mean, for a myth to really work or have that power, it has to be coming from something, coming from older civilizations, in part of this sort of ancient conversation, right, that spans the millennia. And so, but to the extent that it's referencing these older cultures and older civilizations, that's more the sort of an aspect of the deep culture. But to the extent that it's referencing the contemporary culture, and using the example of Über-Chad, it's referencing in particular this sort of online meme folklore. It's that's sort of the kind of skin that makes it appear as a new mythos, um, and it is a new mythos. But I think that the mythos is especially defined by its messaging and its telos. Where is it pointing us? In what direction is it pointing? In what direction is it pointing civilization? And I think for a long time, I mean, I think we have quite frankly, to some important extent, we've had a kind of a different telos. And I think that we're in a kind of chaotic moment where that telos is no longer motivating people, or it's motivating them in a bad direction ultimately. And so we need a mythos that that develops a different ethos and develops a different telos, and that's what Über-Chad is. And that's, it sounds like you feel like I've said a couple of pretentious things in this podcast. That's fine. I mean, I think that this is ultimately Über-Chad is serious, right? It's a serious thing. And in a couple of things that I would say regarding the comedy elements, because the comedy elements, so we'll return to the comedy aspect of this. For example, in Über-Chad, there are characters that seem like they're sort of joke characters. They're kind of unserious. For example, we have chuds, right? Chuds are a kind of, or a species of white, we call them, a kind of ghoul or vampire. And white, the word for white is Wight. It's similar in the same word is used in Game of Thrones, right? So the that big undead army, they're called an army of whites. And I think probably there's symbolic reasons why that term is used instead of ghoul or ghast or something else. So we have chuds. But that's a kind of, it seems like it's kind of a joke character. And on some level it is. I mean, there is an element of humor there, obviously, and it's used with the intention of humor. But I think if you look at the Batman mythos, for example, you'll find similar things. You'll find, for example, the villain, the Penguin, or you'll find the villain, the Joker, or the Riddler, right? And they also seem kind of, at least in their origin, they seem like these sort of frivolous characters that, to some extent, are, some humor obviously is intended, and to some extent, you can understand them as kind of send-ups of, and to the extent that the author is imagining a kind of real-life equivalent or analog for the villains that he's depicting in his comic book, you can understand them as being used to lampoon these characters, for example. And so in a manner to belittle them through humor. And so I think that something like that is also occurring in Über-Chad. And another character I'd point to is there's a character called Capital Pig. And this is capital with a O as opposed to an A. So it's sort of a play on Capital Pig. And Capital Pig is the leader of the swamp golems, right? So he's kind of understood as controlling both sides of the aisle politically. He's paying off both sides, and I won't go into the lore of Capital Pig and the swamp golems or anything like that, but he's understood as controlling politics. I mean, that's a sort of clear, it's not, there are metaphors involved here, but it's clearly being suggested that he's someone who's basically paying off both sides of the political aisle, of the political aisles in politics. But he seems on the face of it a kind of like, a character you might see in a political cartoon or a caricature, comical in a way, not a serious character, right? But again, I would look at the example of Batman, where through the different uses, and in the hands of different artists, like Christopher Nolan, for example, has a treatment of the Joker, and you see that basically these a mythos like the Batman mythos, there are different genres that can be applied. So you can make a comedy with the mythos, or you can make a drama or a tragedy, right? So I think that's also what I'm going for with Über-Chad. And with Über-Chad as well, it's an homage. Ultimately, the style of the comic is an homage to the Silver Age of comics, when Stan Lee was sort of at the height of his powers and was a very prolific, um, creator in the comic book scene. So the style of the comic, the visual style of it, is an homage to Silver Age comics, and I think that there's actually much to sort of recommend that style. It comics will in the 70s become darker and they'll become moodier and sort of more emo, you might say. But from in the Silver Age of comics is, I think it's 53 to 1970. That's how it's been classed. A Jewish guy, wrote a book he basically classified the different eras of comics, and but it's a kind of brighter style. You could argue that at least on a kind of superficial level, it's more diurnal, it's more Apollonian. You can see the characters clearly. It's less noir, less moody and dark, and and I think that there's something on one hand, we're also doing something kind of retro, so that's fun, and so we're doing something kind of different in that regard. But I also think that there is something kind of inherently valuable about making something more diurnal aesthetically. I think that you have to reach people where they are. So, I mean, this is sort of my philosophy in art. So I think that if someone were to make the decision that I'm going to make something kind of darker and moodier, but I'm going to embed it with themes that are ultimately moralizing and themes that are of my perspective and are sort of promoting my perspective, per our earlier discussion on this podcast, I think that that's legitimate, and I wouldn't be critical of a different style in this. Like, so if you wanted to adopt a kind of darker style, I get it. But this fits also because it's a comedy, right? And a comedy in both. And again, a spoiler alert. I don't want to give away too much, but I mean, of course, the intention here is ultimately to create a series, and so we know, at least because of that Über-Chad will survive this first story. But that it ultimately is a comedy in the ancient sense of that term, in the sense that it has a happy ending. And I think that there is something moralizing and encouraging about having a happy ending, especially when the audience is represented by the character that is successful and has a happy ending. And just to return to this theme a little bit more, one man's happy ending is another man's sad ending. That's sort of just a kind of that's sort of part of the cruelty of nature and the reality of life. If you get the beautiful woman, that means that someone else doesn't get the beautiful woman, right? There's always a kind of winner and loser, as it were. So one man's comedy is another man's tragedy, is another way of looking. In any case, in summary, because I think that these podcasts will have to be, or at least to start, they'll have to be between 45 minutes and an hour, just for time considerations, my own schedule and so forth. But I think that we probably can pack interesting ideas into that 45 minutes to an hour. And maybe in the future I'll have guests and I'll talk to other people, especially themes. I mean, there could be a variety element of this as well. So I think we'll focus on culture and art, and especially messaging in culture and art. But we may also talk about, there may be some politics, or we may talk about more common social things, such as the battle of the aforementioned battle of the sexes, for example, online. I mean, that would be one example. It's not I think that that's kind of been done to death to some extent, but though it does seem like there's a kind of endless hunger for those types of topics because, I mean, individuals are naturally interested in those things and the things relating to relationships and happiness and mating and so forth. But so the format will come into shape. It will. This is the first podcast, so we'll see where it goes from here. But I would encourage people to go to newdelphimedia.com and to get the comic. newdelphimedia.com and get the comic. And the name of the comic is The Adventures of Über-Chad, and Alliance: The Adventures of Über-Chad. All right, I think that I think this is a good place to stop.
Sick of the same old phony, dated, irrelevant Hollywood cape shit? Looking for a real hero, one summoned from the collective unconsciousness of humanity itself, rather than whipped up artificially by some New York boomer nerds from the 60s. New Delphi Media is proud to announce the Alliance: Adventures of Über-Chad. More athletic than sports ball, stronger than Gruggum, more intelligent than Galaxy Brain, richer than Capital Pig, more famous than fake news, more noble than the Eternal Anglo, and better looking than the Pseudo-Chads. Über-Chad, real name Chad Havoc, is not some cringeworthy self-help guru, some weightlifting internet philosopher, or a pickup artist douche-knuckle. Rather, he's legitimately a king with huge Sigma male energy who has actually accomplished a useful thing or two IRL. Remember the flying car rule from Über-Chad invented it. Hell, Über-Chad invented and controls an AI named Neuro, so powerful that it would certainly enslave and probably improve the world if Über-Chad allowed it. Über-Chad has invented a suit comprised of a liquid atomically governable extra-dimensional metal able to assume any form that he commands. When mobbed by evil fangirls, Über-Chad may form this suit into a protective manosphere to fend off their attacks. After all the superhero and villain girls love him. These darlings include the beautiful synthwave, the modest trad wife, the Pixme, the Karen cyborg sentinel leaders, the waifu, the famous Miley Cyrus, Hypergam Stacy, the party girl, the web girls, Ethos, even the femoids, even the Greek goddess of social justice herself. All these babies are either openly or secretly obsessed with Über-Chad, and if one of them can't have him, no one can. In any case, Über-Chad, his boss, Muscle Man Rick DeBanks, and bigger Muscle Man General Havoc are the founding members to the superhero team, the Alliance. The Alliance is the only thing preventing a cabal of reptiloids and their mind-controlled freaks called the Cathedral from terrorizing normies and utterly destroying the world. But of course, in this mad world, who can really tell who is part of the Alliance and who is part of the Cathedral? On whose side, for instance, is the Mason, the Pagan, the Transhuman, Deep State, Q, the Russian Bear, the God Emperor, his son-in-law, Cuckoo, the Swamp, and its obedient swamp goals, Clownhole, Boomer, Demon Rat, the Demonized, Arch-Demon Lord of the Demonizing Anti-Demonization League, the Black Bloc, Hybrid Vigor, Nazbol, the Fascies, and Cartoon Nazi. And what about the insane trolls, Kek, Hate-Chan, and Incel? And let's not forget about the tinfoil, hat and suit gay, the White Knight, Jonah Simpson, and super profound spiritual philosopher guy. And of course, let's remember the manlets, including Bugman, Moldybug, Pettinat, and Southerner. Also, the God Gang, Deus Vult, Tradcat,
Orthopro, the fabulous Flamer.
But again, who in the end is part of the Cathedral and who is part of the Alliance? Find out in the Alliance: Adventures of Über-Chad, the anti-cape ship.